All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this amazing webinar on mindfulness and SEL. My name is Rachel Escobedo. I will be your moderator today, and our speaker is Chris Reyna. We are thrilled to have Chris here today with you. This is a very special webinar. We've been looking forward to this for some time. Just a couple ground rules before I introduce Chris. So this webinar is being recorded. You will receive a copy of the recording in 24 to 48 hours. And if you do have questions, you can ask them in your questions box. We will be stopping for questions, I think, a couple times throughout this webinar. But if we will hold the majority of the questions until the end of the webinar. Okay. And without further ado, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Chris. So Chris Reyna is the founder of Leading Without Ego. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Management at Virginia Commonwealth University. He coaches leaders and leads trainings on mindful leadership and how to more effectively manage the emotional space within organizations. Christopher is especially interested in understanding the impact of leadership on followers and how this translates to customer, patient, and student outcomes. Chris received a PhD in Business Administration from the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. He has corporate experience in leadership training and development and experience in the realm of education as a co-founder of Heroes for Students, an EdTech nonprofit based in Phoenix, Arizona. All right, Chris, thank you. Take it away.
Wonderful. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. Thank you to Rachel and Sanford Harmony for having me, and it's a true pleasure to be here with you today. I wanted to start by getting you all engaged from the very beginning. A couple prompts for you to answer. What is your role currently in your organization, and what are you hoping to learn today? Feel free to submit those thoughts in the question box, and Rachel will help us out. Take 10 or 20 seconds.
Thanks, Chris. All right, we have our responses coming in. School counselor, middle school, grades 5 through 8, school social worker, assistant principal, counselor, lots of counselors. Oh my goodness, the comments are pouring in. Mental health counselor, social emotional learning coordinator. Let's see, associate faculty, SCOE, facilitator, psych practicum student, head of student services. I'll do maybe 2 more. After school staff, training assistant, we got a lot of counselors on the line. This is great, guys. You're going to enjoy this. I got 3 school psychologists. Awesome. Thank you so much for your participation, guys.
Rachel, any comments around what they're hoping to learn today, or did that not come up yet?
Yes. So some things that people have said are, how do I best support my teachers from an outside point of view to promote mindfulness in the classroom? So that's supporting teachers. Another person says, I'm hoping to learn how to help teachers use mindfulness in the classroom as well as use mindfulness with my struggling students.
Okay.
Looking to learn how to integrate mindfulness into our SEL program. And let's see.
Maybe one more.
Hoping to learn more mindfulness strategies to teach in a small group in classroom lessons. So similar responses.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks everyone for sharing. I believe we're going to cover all of those throughout. We have about 50 minutes to connect, so it'll be quick. It'll be brief, but there'll be ways to engage further after this. So let's perhaps recognize that this is the moment that we've been waiting for, really the moment to relax. Perhaps it's not what you thought I would say, but this idea that the moment right now, right here is enough is really a fundamental belief in mindfulness. And while the quote sounds nice, and I think we all buy into it intellectually, where the rubber meets the road is whether we're able to put this quote into action. Right now, right here, can we relax and let our shoulders down a bit, fully be attentive and present together in this shared experience, And can we make the most of it? Research shows that about 50% of the time our mind will wander. And so to me, mindfulness is really that activity of continually bringing that attention back to the present moment, because this moment is all that we need and really all that we have. And so because our day is chaos, oftentimes, perhaps this might be the only minute when we get to take a purposeful pause. So what I'd like us to do is just do that. Give ourselves permission to take a pause. I'm going to do a mindful moment here at the beginning, and then I'll refer to this mindful moment as we go through the rest of the presentation, sort of drawing your attention to what we did in this short time together. So the question to ask yourself is, how many times throughout the day do we just take a moment for ourselves to slow down, to be in the present moment? So if you're comfortable, I'd like to invite you to just relax a bit in the chair, perhaps let your shoulders down. If it's comfortable for you, go ahead and close your eyes. If you'd rather not close your eyes, just a soft gaze forward is just fine. Take a couple deep breaths. Just acknowledge how your body's feeling. Maybe acknowledge that this is a little strange. At 1 o'clock Eastern, you are on a webinar, breathing with over 1,000 other folks, or around 1,000. Just acknowledge that for what it is, and remember to breathe deeply, letting go of the anxieties and stresses. Nothing that came before this matters at the moment. Nothing that you do after this webinar matters at the moment. Just right here, right now. As I imagine each of you across the US and perhaps beyond, we're all doing different things in our different worlds. Perhaps there's different noises occurring. Can you just mindfully listen to what noises you can hear in the environment in which you're in? What can you hear right now? I want us now to think about how our body is situated in the chair that we're in. What does it feel like to have the weight of the body resting in the chair? It may sound like a strange concept, but what does it feel like? Can you notice the pressure points of your feet where it's resting on the ground? What does that feel like to have the feet resting on the ground? And finally, let's move back to the breath. What does it feel like to take an in-breath? Can you notice the brief pause between in-breath and out-breath? What can you notice about the quality of breath? Is it shallow or deep, quick or slow? As we prepare to end this quick and brief mindful moment, sort of reawaken the senses back to the present moment here on the webinar. And as you're ready, go ahead and open your eyes. So this next slide is just a few rhetorical questions to ask yourself, but what was that experience like? Perhaps you've never taken a moment like that to just do nothing, check in with the body, be aware of the environment around you. Can you note any differences in your body, how it was perhaps feeling before and now feels afterward? And then, of course, because I want this to be an applied webinar and for us to take tangible skills away from it, how could we use just that 2 minutes like I led us through? How can we use that to benefit our day? One more opportunity here to get everyone involved. Let's set the stage a bit. I know folks come from all backgrounds and all different exposures to the word mindfulness. What does it mean? What does it conjure up? Positive, negative, anywhere in between. Feel free to also add those answers to that questions box, and Rachel will read some of them out just to get a diversity of perspectives here on what folks know or think perhaps about mindfulness.
Thank you, Chris. All right, responses are coming in. Feeling centered, here and now, being in the present moment. Mindfulness is being proactive with everything. Calm. Let's see, relaxation, meditation. Aware, negative, eye rolling.
Good. I
um,
want to hear those ones as well.
Conjures up confusion. Many people have their own definition and idea of what mindfulness is and how it can or when. Um, let's see, being aware of the moment, reducing anxiety, a state of what you feel at the moment of being aware of it. Let's see, consciousness of oneself, taking only what you need. All right, one more. Being, oh, didn't realize how much my back hurt. Interesting. So some people are aware of what they were feeling. All right, thank you so much for your responses, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, Rachel. So we saw a diversity of perspectives there. Overwhelmingly, I would say sort of positive and calming and a benefit to the body. But right, I think it's also important to acknowledge that not everyone knows what mindfulness is, or not everyone has a positive feeling about mindfulness. Perhaps it seems based on how some people use it that it's spiritual, or that it's religious, or that it requires meditation, right? So there's different ways that we come at understanding mindfulness. I like to call those out because as someone mentioned in the comment, it's really important for us to build up a definition of mindfulness together and establish what we mean before we talk about it. So that way everyone can come at what mindfulness is and how we use it in the classroom and in our workplace from a common perspective. So I think that's a useful exercise. And now let's begin to really cover what mindfulness is and how we use it at work and in the classroom. But before we go, set the stage a little further. What are we going to do today? The basics of mindfulness. What is it? How do we use it next? All of us want some more strategies to do it. And while I can't promise I can give you strategies that will change fundamentally the way that your classroom operates or that you relate with teachers, what I can promise is an increased knowledge of why it's important to be mindful, to show up mindfully, and what those benefits are for you as an individual, as well as all the folks that you interact with, whether those be other teachers or students, or perhaps your staff members at the school. So really this interpersonal benefit of mindfulness, we're going to spend quite a bit of time on, and how we cultivate that in our classroom. And I want to be sure to leave at least 10 or so minutes for your questions so we can address those before adjourning. So you've probably heard the definition that's commonly given, which is the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment without judgment. I believe in this definition, I value this definition, but I often find, as the folks that I speak to, that this definition seems perhaps a bit difficult to interpret, or difficult to engage with on a daily basis at work and at school. So let's have this definition, let's take the pieces of this definition, but let's assemble it in a way that's more useful perhaps for us, and more able to be utilized throughout the workday in our classrooms. So let's talk about what mindfulness is, and let's talk about what mindfulness isn't. If we talk about mindfulness, it really needs to be a state. It's a state of mind. We are mindful now, and perhaps we're not mindful later in the afternoon. And this is an important distinction, because if mindfulness were a trait, well, then we'd be born with it or not, and then we wouldn't try to have a webinar on it to help everyone cultivate more mindfulness. So it's important to recognize and realize that it is a state of mind, and in it being a state, it means we can work on it, we can develop it, and we can increase our capacity to be more mindful over time. And it really deals with two fundamental aspects, which I'll call here awareness and attention. And you saw those figure into the Jon Kabat-Zinn definition we saw on the last slide. So let's take each component here and let's do a quick exercise, if you will, thought experiment on two words. We have awareness and we have attention. Let's define awareness very broadly as the sum total of all that occurs within you and outside of you. For example, let's say a teacher's in the classroom. He or she is teaching. What's going on in the larger set of awareness are perhaps the thoughts in his or her head. They're going on. Maybe it's the sound of a pencil as a student writes. Perhaps it is the whistle being blown outside during recess. It is this inside and outside large set of things going on in this larger set of awareness. Now, attention is that privileged set or slice of the larger awareness that the individual turns toward and thus pays attention to, right? So if awareness is the sum total of all that's going on, attention is what we tune into, if you will. And as you can see here on the slide, this intention piece, the skill piece, the skillful deployment piece helps us pick out what out of the larger awareness we want to focus our attention on. Another quick example here is the exercise that we did. You are currently sitting in a chair and your body is exerting a weight against the chair, but it wasn't until I called your attention to that were you able to pick that out and focus on it. It was happening in the larger awareness, but we weren't attending to it. Same thing with the breath. The breath is happening all on its own, every moment of every day, yet as soon as we acknowledge it, we are then able to control the breath because we're attuning, we're being attentive to the breath. And finally, the exercise that we had with hearing. All of those things are going on in our environment, whether we're paying attention to them or not. So mindfulness then is this skillful ability to focus intentionally on what aspects we want to out of the larger awareness. So we're getting closer to the definition I want to present. But first, a food example always makes me understand the concept a little bit better. Let's look at this graphic here. I want to think about mindfulness as an attentional pie. If we only have so much of it, it's a scarce resource. Think about how our language even utilizes the word attention with the verbs that we use for attention. We tell people to pay attention. Pay suggests that it is a valuable thing that we have to give up. If I'm paying for this, I'm not able to pay for that. So even in the way we talk about attention, we recognize that it's somewhat of a scarce resource. And if I'm devoting some attention to one task, I can't devote it to the other task. So another simple way to think about mindfulness is who and what in successive moments of time are getting your attention. It's a really nice way to think about mindfulness. And mindfulness is really that skillful ability to ensure what you intend to have your attention focused on is truly what's happening. Oftentimes, as we'll discuss today, so much of our thought process and our emotional processes are get caught up in things that don't matter, and they further segment multiple pieces of our attentional pie. And what we see is that we don't have the resources, the attentional resources, to be present in the moment because we're so stressed. The emails are stacking up. Perhaps it's things going on in our private lives that are stacking up, but our attentional pie is getting so divvied up. It's really difficult for us to pay attention to what really matters. If you're fans of Stephen Covey's work, the idea of beginning with the end in mind and filling up the rock jar with your biggest pieces first, and then the smaller rocks, and then the sand on the top, this idea that you have to start with what matters and give your attention to what that is. Otherwise, these little tiny slices of attention will deplete your overall ability to pay attention. So let's move on now, but let's build up a definition of mindfulness as simply skillful or intentional deployment of attention. Skillful deployment of attention. I think that can resonate with us as we work and as we teach and as we lead. This idea that what I'm spending my attentional resources on is that what I intend to be focusing my attention on. And if we find that that's not the case, then we can mindfully come back to focusing our attention in the way that we intend. Well, how good are we at this? A 2010 study in the Science Journal, or in Science Journal, suggests that we are pretty bad at committing our attention to what we intend for it to be on. For example, on average, 46.9% of you right now are not paying attention. And what I mean by that is that your mind is wandering. And so instead of being hard on self, it's important to recognize that that's how the human mind works, right? It's made to think. I'll say something, it'll make you go off on a tangent and think about it. That's okay. But where mindfulness shows up is that acknowledgement, that awareness that the mind has wandered, and bringing it back to that focal point, that intended point, which is hopefully, since you're on this webinar, is to pay attention. Right? So it's not so much that our attention slips, it's rather that we're able to bring that attention back and strengthen that connection over time, almost like building a muscle. And we'll talk about that later in the webinar. It's also important to say what mindfulness is not. We perhaps, if we have heard some more of the answers that you all had, we might have seen some of these. Because a lot of folks would necessarily attribute mindfulness to meditation. Perhaps it seems like it may be tied to a spirituality or religion, or maybe it's just something that some people can benefit from, but not everyone. So I want to dispel some of those myths. As we've created the definition of mindfulness as skillful deployment of attention, there's nothing inherently spiritual or religious about that. However, if you think about it, some of the things that various spiritual practices include or religious practices include could be fitting under the definition of intentional attention or skillful deployment of attention. So I think many of the aspects of religion and spirituality could fit under our definition of skillful deployment of attention. But the way we define mindfulness, the way we're going to talk about mindfulness today, there's nothing about it that creates spirituality or religious aspects. There's multiple ways to cultivate mindfulness. Meditation works for a lot of individuals, and meditation is often anchored on the breath. And as you saw, the breath is always with us. And if we just pay attention to the breath, it grounds us and helps us remember what's important. And that even though the breath seems like something we can't control, we actually are in control of the breath if we want to be in every single moment. So I think that's why the breath is such an anchor point for meditative practices and a lot of folks who want to be more mindful. But there's other ways to cultivate it as well. And then finally, the one I love to cover here is that it's not something that only benefits certain people. Right? I've yet to come across someone who says that they don't want to be more effective or more skillful with how they utilize their attention. Again, if attention is a scarce resource, we have to be very careful and guard against who and what gets our attention in case we're giving it away to folks and to events and to thoughts that don't really need our attention. Let's talk more now that we've built up the definition of mindfulness. How do we introduce it to the school environment, and what problems can mindfulness help us with? Well, I think it's clear, whether it's students, whether it's us as leaders or as counselors, right, we have a lot on our plate. We have a lot on our plate at work. We have a lot on our plate at home. And combining the two, plus the stressful commute perhaps that we have, like there's a lot of stress points in our lives. And what happens, I would argue, is that our attentional resources are so depleted that we're not able to show up and be fully present in any one of those locations, whether that be at home or whether that be at school. So we know the problem exists. And what does that problem lead to? Well, the research is very clear on what this stress and anxiety over time leads to. It quite literally puts the body and the mind in what we call a fight or flight or freeze response pattern, in which something happens to us and we respond. There's no space there. And of course, we know the body and the mind are intimately connected. What goes on in the body, if it's a tension in the body, that then manifests in the mind by saying, oh, my body's tense and stressed, so I must be stressed. And that creates more stress in the mind, which then tells the body in a cyclical process that there's stress. And you can see how this sort of escalates up. And quite literally, when we're stressed, when we're anxious, it's the equivalent of fleeing from an enemy. We are engaged in fight or flight, and that means that our highest levels of the human brain, the prefrontal cortex, and our kind of most rational aspects of the brain are disengaged, and we see more aspects of the brain related to getting out of a scenario and surviving. Those are the ones that are engaged. Mostly the amygdala is very much activated and is trying to get you out of the scenario. But if you think about it, why we're stressed in the modern day is not the same way as perhaps we were stressed previously. And when we are stressed and anxious, we don't have a chance to come down off of that stress response, like perhaps in the past that we did. Again, it's an important point to make. Fight or flight is good. Stressors come, they make us react, and then the whole idea is that that stress response goes away, thus returning us to equilibrium. The problem is, because of the modern stressful environment, is that those stressors never go away. We're never coming down off of that stress response. We're always engaged in fight or flight, which means the amygdala is always operating, and we're constantly running from event to event and from scenario to scenario with this feeling of being attacked. And when we're attacked, we're not thinking clearly. We're saying mean and hurtful things. We're not rationally approaching problems. We're not being creative, and we're not ultimately creating those harmonious classrooms that we intend to be creating. So of course, mindfulness can help. That's what this webinar is about. And I just want to go over and spend some time with you on the benefits. The proven research on mindfulness is clear in these specific ways that mindfulness helps reduce a lot of the emotional and behavioral disorders that folks experience. They experience less perceptions of pain, less anxiety, stress goes down, sleep quality improves. Right, so then you see the positive spillover of more sleep in a night lets you go to work more rested, and you can recover even better from a long day at work when mindfulness levels are higher. To further continue some of the benefits, you feel that you have higher levels of well-being. You're more satisfied with life, with school, with your job. And finally, you spend less time ruminating and feeling negative emotions. And this really stems from the idea that what happened in the past happened in the past. And while it may not have been ideal, grasping and wanting things to be different, of course, is a futile exercise. It's not possible to make something in the past go differently now. And same thing to the future to some extent, right? We can prepare for the future, but we can't make the future happen a certain way. Which is why mindfulness is inherently rooted in the present moment. And if we think about it right now, all of us across the world who are existing in this moment together, things are good for most of us, probably right here and right now. It's when we let the stress of what's to come later in the day weigh us down, or we ruminate on what happened in the past or what we would have wished or that we wished would have gone differently. that's when that anxiety and stress creep in. So we see a reduction of that when an individual is more mindful. So that's what happens to the individual. So all of us who cultivate more mindfulness over time can expect those benefits that I went over in the last slide. But this is really fascinating as well. This is where mindfulness, my mindfulness and your mindfulness shows up and positively impacts other people. So this is what I'll call the interpersonal benefits of mindfulness applied to the classroom and to the workplace. As you can see, your ability to focus and ignore distractions increases. If you think about that, what that allows is me to actually hear you. If I'm engaged in a conversation with you and I'm able to tune out that other stuff that doesn't matter, if that stuff is in my own head or if that stuff is in the environment, what that means is a more authentic and deeper connection between the individual I'm talking to. You feel compassion for individuals more. You see similarities instead of differences more readily. You immediately, or you less immediately judge behaviors and thoughts and opinions that other people have. There's a pause there between what they say and what they do, and you needing to create a reason for it. A lot of times it feels very helpful for us to judge a behavior of someone else. Think about it, we're all guilty of this. If we drive, if someone does something that we view as rude or not nice on the highway or the freeway, we attribute that to that person being rude or being a bad person, and we perhaps use some choice words with that individual. Hopefully not, but perhaps some of us do. This idea that we don't have to attribute that to anything. It is what it is. The car did that. The person did that. It's not against us. It's not personal. They weren't trying to spite us. There's no reason to make up a story about that. Now, of course, you could say, well, maybe they're on the way to the hospital and they're about to have a baby. Like, you could make up a story that's positive, and if that's a good strategy for you, I think that's helpful. But I like to get folks to really think about, is that even necessary at all? We don't know the story. We don't need to know the story. The event just happened. It is what it is, right? So when we see folks cultivating more mindfulness, it really results in less judgment of self, less judgment of others, and ultimately kinder responses. And one of my personal favorites is this idea that we are so interconnected. Everything that I do impacts the people around me. The leaders who are mindful, who are more emotionally intelligent, understand that. There's very clear, compelling science that we're amassing every day in the social sciences around just how my emotions help my environment at work, or can hinder it if my emotions aren't in check, if I'm not able to self-regulate a bit, or if I'm sort of flying off the handle when discussing issues with people in my organization, right? So we know that emotions become shared. More mindful folks are better able to regulate those emotions and also understand how we're all connected a bit more. Finally, empathy goes along with compassion, and then we're able to choose a more flexible set of responses rather than a rigid pattern in which we always utilize. I put this slide up here because no matter if we're school counselors, if we are other school administrators, teachers, professors, folks who are working in nonprofit or corporate, it doesn't matter who we are, parents, we're all on a stage. Everyone is attributing and watching what we do and what we say at all times. And this idea is some of the work that I've done in the corporate sector, but it just shows that, hey, everything you do as a leader sends a message. And everything you don't do as a leader also sends a message. And people make up attributions for why you do and say certain things. And when it comes down to it, a lot of the environment that students feel in the classroom is created by the teacher. And a lot of the environment that the teachers feel in school is helped created by the administrators. And in the corporate world, the leadership has a big impact on how people feel at work. And while students don't necessarily have the option to leave the classroom, they do have the option of emotionally leaving or psychologically disengaging from the classroom when that environment isn't one in which they can connect, in which they feel, or one in which they feel valued. So again, a way to think about mindfulness in the realm of leadership, whatever that leader position is that you have, as a person who's more aware of what they say and do mattering, and able to make that connection between what they do and the fact that other people pick up on that, whether it's intended or not. So I often say for mindfulness, especially in a talk as short as this one, my major goal really is to have everyone come around to the idea of understanding that awareness is the key. What you do with that awareness then becomes the second step. But what I hope to have accomplished today and in the next 15 or so minutes is to have us recognize, stop, and reflect perhaps just how mindless we are. From getting up in the morning, rolling out of bed, checking the cell phone, maybe it's looking at our email, whatever it is, what does that morning look like? How do we drive to work? How do we show up to our first meeting at work? How do we engage with our classroom or our staff or our students every day? I think if we're honest with ourselves, I think it goes right back to that quote that we said from 2010 Science article of 46.9% of the time, our attention is not really where we want it to be. And I would argue that it's mindless. Most of the time we're on mindless autopilot. As a leadership professor and consultant, I talk a lot about types of leadership. One of them is empowering leadership. Empowering leadership, of course, is when a leader empowers followers, but I like to think of mindfulness as the ultimate empowering leadership for self. Think about that. If I'm an individual and my attention can be all over the place throughout the day, mindfulness represents my ability to skillfully engage my attention on who and what I believe deserves the attention and I want to commit the attention on. That's ultimately very, very empowering when we can regain control over what's happening in our mind. So again, awareness is the key here. Let's move now to putting it all together and then move into the classroom and into the workplace. So when you're more mindful through this process of intentional deployment of attention, you're able to align your body and mind, and that stress and anxiety falls away. You can be much more in the zone of rational thinking versus the fight or flight reactions, and that enables more authentic and deep connections with other people. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause here and see if we have any questions. A caveat being that the next section of the slides really goes into how do we apply this, how do we set up our workplaces and our classrooms to create these types of environments. But any questions so far on what we've heard?
Thank you, Chris. Let's see. We have one coming in. What was the last interpersonal benefit of mindfulness? I think it's a clarifying question.
The last interpersonal benefit, let's go back. This one, so empathy, ability to better regulate emotions, and to be a bit more flexible in your responses. I didn't cover the regulating emotions, but I think it's an important point since you brought it up. It's not that the mindful individual doesn't feel positive emotions or doesn't feel negative emotions. So it's not that you're not feeling them. It's not that you're disinterested and disengaged, which is a common misperception, but it's rather you don't have these high and large swings of positive and negative emotions. You are with the negative emotion. It is what it is, and it passes. And the positive emotion is the same. It's a wonderful experience that you had, and it also passes. So if you think about a ship, I think the example often is when you're more mindful, you experience just what it's like underneath the water, an ocean, let's say. Just below the surface of the water, there's that calm. Versus if you're a ship and you're a lightweight ship on the top of the water, these storms really throw you around and you really get derailed up and down. but mindfulness is sort of more of that kind of calm, serene approach where you don't feel the highs so high and then come crashing down, but rather kind of take them all as they come.
Thanks, Chris. All right, we have a number of questions coming in. We'll probably have to
Sure.
hold some of them for the end, but okay. How to implement this with young children, elementary age?
Okay.
That would be, I think you're going to be covering that, Chris. So do you want to hold that one?
Oh yeah, yeah. Let's hold that one because I will cover that.
Okay. Let's see. And I hope I'm not putting you on the spot here, Chris, but someone is asking, are there any statistics on how this field of research has helped students?
Yes, there's more and more research being done. It's one of my areas of passion. It's always challenging to get the partnerships, to get get the data, and of course do it in a way. It's always one of those things. Also, when you're in the classroom, are you changing it as you're measuring it? Because as soon as you draw someone's attention to the fact that they're not paying attention, you fundamentally sort of change the experience. But a lot of the statistics that, or the facts that I showed in the previous slides have been shown in the classroom for helping students tend to pay attention better, to reduce what I would call this mind exercise that's going on of always talking about not being good enough or not understanding something or feeling stupid. I think we can all relate to that, and it's certainly happening with our kids and with our children in the classroom. So I don't have a stat off the top of my head for how mindfulness has changed classrooms, but we certainly know that the research is clear on what it does to the individual, including children, when it comes to psychological well-being, reducing that anxiety and that stress. And then, of course, the research is also very clear on when you are in a frame of mind without those inhibiting things, you are much more open to learning, to remembering, to connecting, to being creative, all things that we want in the classroom.
All right, perfect. Okay, we have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to ask just one more and we'll save the rest for the end of the presentation.
Perfect.
Okay, let's try. Well, if we could keep this response somewhat brief, that would be great. Okay, the question is being mindful a constant state of mind, or is it something we must intentionally bring ourselves to?
I love that question because it's at the very heart of what the challenge is, right? So I think it's very much about remembering to do it, which is a perfect segue to our next slides. Most of us, without cultivating and setting out to cultivate mindfulness all the time, we're going to struggle with it. Our mind is going to go off. It's going to go away from that present moment. But if you think about a flower, I love this analogy. Think about a flower and think about the middle part of the flower and then think about the petals. The middle part of the flower represents our intention, what we are intending to focus our attention on. And every single time our intention slips, or rather our attention slips, we create a petal, and then we remember and recognize that our attention has slipped and we bring it back to our intention. And then it happens again, and we weave this delicate flower, the flower of attention. This idea that you set your intention, and then every time you slip away from that intention, you are aware of it, you recognize it, and you bring that attention back. It's almost like working out. It's like working out a muscle group. Over time, you're building that capacity for that attentional muscle. And to directly address that question, it becomes more automatic over time. And so you'll spend less time being off task or not paying attention to what you want to. So it's a continually, it's a journey. It's not a destination. But as you do it more, it'll sort of give you bigger benefits so that you don't have to constantly focus on it as much. It just begins to happen more often.
All right, thanks, Chris. We'll hold the rest for for Q&A.
Perfect. Okay, so what does mindfulness look like during the day? Well, this is how it looks. It looks like preparing instead of showing up. And I know that sounds simple, but how often do we rush from activity to activity and wonder, how can I possibly do this activity well when I haven't prepared? Right? So sometimes we just show up, but preparing is a huge part of it, right? So the teachers, all the educators in the room know that, but in life, it's the same way. I work with a lot of folks in the corporate world and say, when meetings are scheduled back to back to back, how can folks possibly be present when they haven't had a chance to let their shoulders down a bit, to relax, to let go of some of that anxiety and stress? So there's really a lot about preparing that goes into a successful lesson, that goes into a successful discussion with a student. Before I have students come into my office hours or give a big talk, I always say I start with that end in mind. What do I want people to feel when they leave? The words will come. I know the content area, but how do I want people to feel? Right? That's the end in mind. That's such a big piece of preparing. And yet, even when I work with my students, I ask them, how much time did you spend on the content of your PowerPoint? And they'll say 90%, 99%. And I say, how much time did you spend on what you want the audience to feel and experience during the presentation? And it's usually 1%. Right? I think the mindful leader, the mindful school administrator, the teacher is really intentional about what that experience is that they want to cultivate. And how do we do that? Well, it really does come down to structure, right? So how do we build mindfulness into our day intentionally? I like to focus here and just say, there's a lot of things you do every day. Start there. Start with making those more intentionally mindful. What about washing your hands? Can you wash your hands a bit more mindfully and let the stress of the day go? I work with a lot of physicians and help them do that. Again, not adding something to their day, but rather creating an experience, a better, more mindful way to do something they already do. Think about your commute. Can you let your mind relax? And do you have to be focused on your huge task list when you get to work? Or can you just have that time be some quiet time where you just are? You just let your shoulders down and you just relax a bit. We're familiar with putting perhaps our children in timeout or that idea, but adults, we need the same thing. We need timeouts. We need to create structure. So one thing that we can do in the classroom is just provide opportunities for students to reflect. Culturally, we're pretty bad at understanding what we're feeling. We know whether it's positive emotions or whether it's negative emotions, but what kinds of emotions, what shades of emotions, and why are we feeling that way? So exercises to help students do that is really important. So reflection exercises, allowing them to feel it, allowing them to call it what it is, allow them to work through it. That's something we can give students to do in the classroom, but that does take a little bit of time. We have to build that in an intentional, structured way. I think we're well positioned with utilizing Sanford programs and Harmony to build these structures into the classroom, right? Meet up and buddy up, do that. If you think about this idea that mindfulness really is intentional deployment of attention, getting students to buddy up with peers and to discuss what's on their mind and to learn about unique experiences of other people allows them to surface questions and then get perspectives on those questions from that individual. It's developing social skills. It's letting us express. It's letting students understand and deal with the ambiguity of emotions, and it's helping them work through conflict, right? So I like to just mention that these two things are already mindful structures, if you will, that can be built into the classroom very nicely in 2 minutes, perhaps in some cases where you can get students to share, to connect, and to ultimately be present and learn what that feels like. right? If there's thoughts in their head about not feeling good enough or not getting the content or feeling lost, right? What a gift we can give our students when we have them buddy up, when we have them share. What you do is create a collective experience that allows that anxiety and stress of the individual person to go away, right? And creating a psychologically safe environment and a more harmonious classroom. So think of those two things that you're probably already doing, and sort of use those as guides to build in more mindful time in the classroom. So for the teacher, what is this going to do, and how do we make buddy up and meet up type activities helpful for the teacher as well? Well, when you're in the classroom and you've cultivated mindfulness and you have a practice of mindfulness, perhaps it's during a prep period, if you have one of those, can you spend 2 minutes just being quiet and allowing the stress to fall away and to transition from what you were doing before to what your next challenge will be? So can you build some time in for you? And oftentimes we're also giving and we want to take care of people. We also have to realize we have to take care of self. So those 2 minutes spent on self are some of the best gifts we can give to other people, because that fundamentally changes how we show up with those people in our lives, whether those be students or teachers or our loved ones at home. And then I think this final piece here is this more intentional lesson and experience for students. Remember, we're starting with the end in mind. We're more intentional of what the hope is, what the experience is meant to offer, and what kind of connections we want students to draw. Really thinking that through and allowing students to play with those ideas is a really powerful way to increase mindfulness in the classroom as they make those connections. But there has to be room for them to share those ideas as they come up. And then often, the think, pair, share works really well, because you get all students from various levels of shyness and ability to contribute. So what does this look like for individuals in the workplace? Well, same as the slide before, but targeted a bit here to understanding and hearing people and developing self-awareness, right? That's what the goal is. As we are leaders, we are developing self-awareness so people can give us feedback and it doesn't hurt our feelings, but we're able to take that feedback and learn from it and do things differently, which ultimately signals to other folks that we can create and we want to create more trusting and close working relationships. I'm going to go through this next couple of slides pretty quickly as we prepare for sort of the last 5 minutes of questions. But this, as someone asked earlier, is a practice. It is something we have to cultivate and continually come back to doing. It's a capacity we can grow, just like we can grow sort of in our physical muscles of the body. We can grow the attentional muscles of our mind. You'll have this slide deck, and I encourage you to look through some of these ways to practice. But it's all about intention. Intention and structure go through all of these right here. These don't just happen. You have to remember to have them happen, and you can use your technology to help you be more intentional about being mindful. To put it all together here, well, we know mindfulness reduces stress. It shows up really importantly in our relationships that we have with other people. There's a short-term and a long-term benefit, and the key to mindfulness is intentional attention. I'd like to leave with a final quote here. I'll let you read that for a moment. And I think we now move into the time, Rachel, where we can take some questions, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chris. Yes, we won't be able to get to everyone's questions today, but if you do have some questions, now's the time to put them into your box, and I will address them if possible. All right. So a question from earlier is, how can I inspire my staff to be more mindful? Are there tools I could share with intergenerational staff?
Yes, that's a common question. So of course, folks take their cues from leadership, right? So it's very important that we sort of practice what we preach, and that we become more mindful. We become the change we want to see, really. So starting a meeting with a quick pause, or a moment to just acknowledge that people came from all different crazy events to get there, just taking a moment to relax at the beginning and to get that sort of intentional attention built up is a really powerful way. Most people arrive just in time for a meeting and worry about getting put on the spot. It closes down the mind, closes down that creative thinking. But if we can just build a structure at the beginning of a meeting, just acknowledge, let's take a moment. This is probably a stressful day for all of us. Just take a quick moment, feel like you're here, present in mind and body, and then we'll go ahead and get started. It's amazing just what a simple shift will do. And by the way, I didn't talk about this, but there's lots of studies out there with measuring cortisol levels, not to be too gross here, but saliva, right? You can measure cortisol in saliva pre and post a mindfulness exercise. You can see an actual reduction in stress hormones after doing a simple 1 to 2 minute breathing exercise. So the physiology is really clear here on what the body typically feels like, which is stress, and then how we can simply reduce that stress through a mindful activity. I'm going to take another question, and I might find another way to bring up some more ideas as we go.
All right. So we have time for just a couple more questions. So how is mindfulness most effective in small group, one-on-one, or in the classroom? Just wondering of the best way to begin implementing this as a beginner.
Yeah, the best way is through just being intentional with all things that you do. So, I mean, what is the goal? I think is a really important question to ask yourself as you go through any of one of those scenarios that you mentioned. And also recognizing that we show up with a lot of baggage, and so does everyone else, right? So it's only when we can really feel and see just how often we're mindless. Sometimes even when waiting here for a question, right, my shoulders are tense. I'm not sure where it's going to go. I have to continually remind myself that the shoulders can be let down, that we can work through this scenario, and that everything's going to be fine, right? Because we let our mind wander away from us a lot. And so as I think you work with folks, it's just creating that psychologically safe place where that can happen, where people can let down their guard. And so I think it's spending quality time with people, and it's not needing to get something done all the time. It's that idea that the journey is the destination, not the destination. And so it should be our goal to be present with people as leaders. And just getting back to that first question as well, we need to stay off our smart devices. We need to make eye contact with people. We need to put down our shoulders and be present with them. And they know the difference, and we know the difference too. If we're wanting to expedite the interaction so that we can move on to something else, it's very clear what that feels like to that other person. So cultivating that is what I think will fundamentally transform small group culture to this, hey, we want to be present with each other, and that looks very different and feels very different than what we've been doing before.
All right, thank you so much. All right, we're gonna address one more. We might go over a minute or two, but we're just gonna address one more question, and I'll mention how you can get in contact with Chris in just a few minutes if you have more questions and you'd like to reach out to him directly. So this question is asking, how can we help students to use mindfulness when learning how to manage their anger?
So the first focal point I would say is just recognizing that they're feeling angry, and calling attention and helping them work through what anger feels like. Is that maybe flushed face? Is that warmth in the face? Is that tense muscles in the arm? Is that wanting to make a fist? What is that manifestation anger, and for that, for any emotion really, as we use the body more effectively and get students more comfortable with recognizing how emotion shows up in the body. Because of that intimate connection between body and mind, that awareness of body will then create a process of in the mind and then a recognition of I'm feeling angry. And then once you know that, it becomes almost a rational thing where you can say, well, I'm feeling angry. Do I want to be angry? And then you can start the process of working through removing that anger. Because oftentimes we just let that feeling emerge and then it changes the way we act. But if we focus on the body, if we then let that connect to our mind around what's going on and create a rational reason for it and to work through that, then therein lies our power to disarm that anger and realize that any attempt that we're going to do right now to get back at whatever's making us angry is really a useless exercise because it is what it is and we probably can't change it. So that mind-body connection is where I'd really start with having children become more mindful over time.
Great, thank you. Chris, let's move on to the next slide. So I just want to thank Chris today for taking the time to really give us some wonderful ideas and inspiration and a breakdown as to what mindfulness is and how it can be incorporated into the classroom and really how it can be used very seamlessly with Meetup and Buddy Up. So those of you who are using Stanford Harmony, this really goes hand in hand, and I think are the Meetup and Buddy Up practices really enhance mindfulness. So those of you who had questions, more questions about how to like strategies for how to incorporate it into the classroom, start with Meetup and Buddy Up. Those quick connection cards, they have great questions that really do focus on sort of mindfulness exercises that Chris had mentioned before. That's a really tangible piece that you can use in your classroom. If you're interested in those materials and like to partner with us, please you can send me an email and I will get you hooked up with the right person who can introduce the program to you and get you started. And of course, if you have questions for Chris, let our audience know where they can find you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your attention. I know it was a quick session, lots to cover, but I hope you do sort of see and have gotten some value around what mindfulness is and how it can ultimately, I believe, transform how we interact with other people and fundamentally change their interaction and ability to be successful in their endeavors. You can reach me by leadingwithoutego@gmail.com is probably the best way.
Great. I know some of you had questions about how to get mindfulness, how to get this idea of mindfulness started at your school, how to speak to administrators, how to convince others that this is something that could that should be focused on. I think Chris could give you some pointers on how to approach those conversations with your leadership. All right. Thank you so much again for everybody for your time. Once this webinar closes, a very short survey is going to launch. It's only 5 questions. Again, we really, really, truly appreciate you taking the time to fill that out. We listen to you guys. We helps us make better webinars for you in the future. So we definitely appreciate any feedback you could provide us. And thank you again, Chris. We hope to have you on again in the future. But with that, I'll let everyone go and enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.
Bye.